Hi, my name is John Bacon-Shone. This presentation is a presentation I originally designed for taught postgraduate students in Hong Kong U. So the tone of this presentation is intended to be somewhat provocative. So I want you to try and give you some reason for thinking through the issues about maximizing the value of publicly funded data. So my presentation is called Safely Maximizing Value from Publicly Funded Data. So the picture in the top right-hand corner is just confirming that in fact I'm a very long-standing member of Hong Kong U. That's my 40-year presentation. I'm about to retire from Hong Kong U. So my current position is as Director of the Social Science Research Center, and I'm the lead on knowledge exchange. But I've previously been the chair of the Human Research Ethics Committee in Hong Kong U for many years. I was also the lead on research data management. And then for the Law Reform Commission, I became the chair of the Subcommittee on Privacy. And I was a member of the audit team for the Hospital Authority visit by the Privacy Commissioner's Office. So that just gives you some idea. This is not me boasting about my roles, but just showing you the different perspectives I have on the issues about how to safely share and maximize value from publicly funded data. So let's think about what the issues are, and I'm going to start with a rather strong statement. So my starting statement is that publicly funded data are a public good produced in the public interest, which should be made openly available with as few restrictions as possible in a timely and responsible manner that does not harm intellectual property. Now, I cannot take the credit for this statement. It's a statement I've borrowed from somewhere else. The only thing I've done is remove the word research. So this statement was originally a statement about publicly funded research data, but I believe this statement should be true for all publicly funded data. Indeed, I would actually argue it should cover publicly regulated data, but that goes beyond the topic I want to cover today. So, because this was a presentation for students, I set them a number of questions to think through at the beginning. So first of all, do you agree that this statement is indeed justified? In other words, my logic is that public funding should lead to public benefit, I would argue. Secondly, should this apply to all publicly funded data or just research data? So I guess the question is, does all data have potential value? I would argue it does, although that potential may be small. Thirdly, what exactly is a responsible manner? So I will just explain why I think the primary issue actually is privacy. There is an argument from some people that it's about intellectual property risk. Indeed, that's what the UK research councils believed. I don't frankly think there isn't much intellectual property risk except in a few very rare cases. And then there's sort of an implicit question here. How does maximizing public value link to data being made openly available? And if it's not openly available, how can we still maximize the value? And then the last question is about the concept of tragedy of the commons. So this is a concept that's thought through by lawyers and economists. Essentially, the problem is that there are public goods where the person who holds these goods isn't the person who will yield the benefit, and so they don't really see why they should share it, right? So the issue is that as a researcher, I might collect a data set, and I don't really see why I should share that data set with anyone else, even if it's publicly funded, because the benefit doesn't necessarily come back to me, but to everybody else in the community. So we'll see how this plays out, hopefully, in this presentation. So let's start from the position of the Hong Kong government. So their normal answer to concern about the risks of sharing information is very simple. Don't share it, unless required to, even if it's not personal data. And I'll give the example later on about police data on crimes at the district level. So in fact, there is a problem in that Hong Kong doesn't have a government records law requiring them to keep records, nor do we have a freedom of information law which requires them to give access to information. Although both are currently being considered by the Law Reform Commission, indeed, freedom of information was first proposed in 1994 together with the Personal Data Privacy Ordinance. So Christine Lowe and Anna Wu in particular were the ones who were trying to persuade the government in 1994. So this is 25 years ago. This was already being proposed for Hong Kong, and unfortunately we're still not there. Now, Hong Kong government does have a code of access, but unfortunately that code of access is very weak. So why do I say it's very weak? Well, because there are a number of exemptions. So in particular, I'm just going to highlight the ones which are in bold here. So if disclosure would harm or prejudice competitive or financial position or the property interests of the government. Well, clearly, almost any data that the government might ever want to get money for would be the property interests. Now, you might argue, what is the competitive position of the government? That's a rather strange concept. Who are they competing with? Singapore, the mainland, Taiwan, Japan, Korea? And then also it says if the information could only be made available by unreasonable diversion of a department's resources. So of course, all information, there is some cost. There are some resources required to make the information available. The question is, what is unreasonable diversion? So that's left to the government to decide, not you or me. And then it says information where disclosure could be misleading. Well, you might question, why would disclosure of government data be misleading? Or deprive the department or any other person of priority of publication or commercial value. Well, clearly, it will deprive the department of commercial value of any data set. So that can be used to exclude, again, almost anything. And then it says information about any person, including a deceased person. Well, the data protection law, the privacy law, does not cover dead people. So they're actually making exemption broader than the privacy law. So deceased people are not considered, that their data is not considered as personal data under the law. So this is rather bizarre, right? So these exemptions are really very extreme. And indeed, many of us, I think, who are taking part in this conference have had difficulties with the government over these issues. So let me just give you one example. So I was commissioned to do some research by the government. In fact, it was about language in the workplace. And after I'd finished the project, I assumed that the government would make my full report available. And I discovered that they had no intention. They said, we have never released the full reports of these projects funded by this part of government. And I said, this is ridiculous. The whole reason I did this project is to make this information publicly available. They said, no, we think only executive summary needs to be made available. And so when I said, well, then I will release the report, they threatened to sue me for releasing the full report of this government-funded research project. So this was a fund that had been approved through LegCo, right? Clearly a research fund, and the government said if I released the full findings, I would be sued. So they're apparently claiming a commercial interest in a project that was explicitly funded as a research project, not a commercial project, not a project for internal government use. And in fact, the whole point was this was about use of language in the workplace, which would clearly be of benefit to private sector organizations. So it's a ludicrous example in my view. So what about the CEs Election Manifesto? So there were some very positive things in her election manifesto. She said she believed in being more transparent and sharing information. She said, we will increase the transparency of government information and data. Measures include opening up more government data for social policy research and public participation in policy formulation. Well, I'm going to give an example in a minute which shows that actually this hasn't been implemented. And then she said about the archives law that the government will follow up on this after receiving from the Law Reform Commission the report. Now you'll notice there is no mention here of the access to information law, and I have no idea why not. So that implies that yes, she wants to keep the records, but she doesn't necessarily want to make them available to anybody. So one might question the value of records which are not accessible. So let's look at what the Law Reform Commission proposals look like. So these are the consultation proposals which came out in 2019. Of course, they may have been amended after the consultation. So there were many problems with the proposal on archives law. There was a focus only on government records. There was no mention of records of public bodies, so universities, Security and Futures Commission, PCPD, Equal Opportunities Commission would not be covered under the proposals. And there was failure to discuss the core principles of transparency and accountability, which indeed are the core of any records law in most jurisdictions. So this is a really very strange framing of the issues about the need for government records. And when we come to access to information, the proposals also had many problems, including a very narrow definition of public bodies, what I consider to be a dishonest assessment of the effectiveness of the existing Code of Access, clearly in conflict with the assessment that had been done by the Ombudsman, no reference to open data, no reference to metadata, which is the data about how the data was collected, focused entirely almost on cost and administrative convenience, ignoring the principles, ignoring the fact that digital distribution is close to free after the information has been made available the first time, and a ridiculously wide exemption for research and for internal discussion, which would make it very hard to get access to information. So I said at the beginning about responsible sharing. So what do we mean by this? Well, for non-personal data, there are generally no safety problems. Now, I won't say never, I'm saying in general. So there may be some specific situations. For example, if this information, for example, was the detailed plan of a police station or a prison, you might say there is a security reason why that information should not be made publicly available. But that's an extreme example. Most data that has no personal data component, there should normally be no safety reason why that data cannot be shared. As I said, as far as intellectual property is concerned, for publicly funded data, the intellectual property benefits should belong to the community. So there should be no problem, not just for academics, but indeed for the commercial sector to make full use of this data to get the full potential. So the real issue is personal data, and the problem with personal data is how to protect against re-identification. So there are a lot of people who assume if I remove the personal identifier, the direct identifier, then personal data is no problem, but it may be a problem if re-identification could lead to risk. So, unfortunately, the government research contracts still focus on protecting the government's intellectual property rights without any allowance for sharing data. So I spent the last month arguing with a government bureau. They've commissioned me to do research for them. In fact, it's not even from government money. It's money that originally came from the Jockey Club. And yet they refuse to put into the contract any possibility of sharing the data. It simply says that I must delete all data at the end of the contract, and I have no right to use the data for anything other than the report I write for the government. So clearly the government has not implemented in any meaningful way this idea that research data, particularly as this data relates to a social problem, that data should be made available for policy research in general. Now, the government trading fund model is also something of a problem when it comes to sharing. So for example, the land registry gets income from maps. The company's registry gets income from fees to access publicly funded data, which clearly limits the ability of everyone to make the best use of the data. Now, to be fair, the land registry has started to make some maps available for free, but you still have to pay for many of the high-resolution maps. So there clearly is a lot more to be done. So I can also tell a little story about this. So I created the Hong Kong language maps, which rely on the 2011 census results. I've given you the link here. You can go to these maps and have a look to see what I've created. I'm creating the 2016 version of these, which will include not only oral languages, but written languages. So I had done a public policy research project. I wanted to share publicly information about which languages are spoken in different constituencies of different districts. So the tables from census data were no problem. The constituency boundaries I thought would be no problem because the Lands Department prepares these for the Registration Electoral Office. So I was told I could have the boundaries, but I could not share them. So this is a little bit ridiculous. How can you share language maps without sharing the constituency boundaries? So I pointed out that the Registration Electoral Office had already paid for this data, so it was ridiculous that I should have to pay if I wanted a license to make this publicly available. So I pushed the Registration Electoral Office, and much to my surprise, the Lands Department gave in. So I should thank the Registration Electoral Office, as I believe it was their intervention that led to me being able to get access to these boundaries. But I think this is a good example of a data set where clearly there's no good reason why it shouldn't have been in the public domain all along. So what about sensitive data? So one of the earlier reports relating to privacy agreed that there were some problems with defining sensitive data. So sensitive data can be culturally specific, and in principle, any personal data can lead to discrimination or other negative consequences. And then a later Privacy Commission paper suggested additional specific protections, but unfortunately that paper was flawed as it failed to distinguish the two types of risks from sensitive data. So one is biometrics. So biometrics are essentially immutable data you cannot change. So this leads to long-term re-identification risks. So your fingerprints, for example, you can't safely change your fingerprints. So if your fingerprints get leaked out into the general public, then other people can pretend to be you by using your fingerprint. And there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas obviously your ID card number, for example, can be changed, even if the government makes it very difficult to do so. So that's one form of risk, this immutable biometrics. The other form of risk is the publication risk. So for example, if this was data about your health status, for example, sexually transmitted diseases, for example, then clearly there is a significant privacy risk. So we need to distinguish between those two things. So those, at least we need to be aware of the particular risks linked to personal data. So what about the role of open data? So open data generally is data that should be freely available to everyone to use, other than perhaps illegal purposes. So usually the license says you may not use it for certain purposes, illegal purposes. But in practice, if the data is freely available, it's very hard for anybody to do anything about illegal purposes other than go and prosecute you for those illegal purposes. And so generally, of course, people can then republish that data, and there are no copyright restrictions, there's no patents, and there's generally no mechanism of control. So this clearly maximizes the potential benefit. However, it means that we need to be sure that the risk is very low of any misuse, because it's very hard to restrict unethical use once you've released data in such an open manner. And in fact, usually we cannot ensure very low risk for personal data, even if it's been anonymized, because of re-identification risks. So what exactly do I mean by re-identification risks? So for example, if I have GPS location data from your phone every hour for even one day, that probably is a unique identifier for you, right? Unless you have spent your whole day in a place where there are thousands of other people, right? Or a large number of other people, it's quite likely that it's unique to your phone. Or for example, if I know the exact time and date of admission to a specific hospital, it's quite likely that you were the only person who was admitted to hospital at that exact time. Or maybe you were with a small group of people. So at least there is a risk of re-identification. Or if I know the IP address of a website you visited and the exact time of address, that's again probably sufficient to be a unique identifier. So we can re-identify many individuals even if the direct identifiers such as ID card number, hospital number, or mobile phone number have been removed. So obviously the more data we collect on each individual, the easier it is to re-identify individuals, and I'll mention, for example, the e-health records in a minute. So what about census data in Hong Kong? So Census and Statistics Department's solution has generally been to destroy all questionnaires after input, make statistical tables available for free, and allow secure access to data sets. So what's the good and the bad about this? Well, the bad is that we can't do future historical research on individuals who are identifiable in census data records. This becomes impossible. Whereas, for example, I was able to go and look at the UK census data from 1911 and find my grandfather in the records and find out who else was living in his house at that time. So these sorts of historical analyses are possible in places where the paper forms have been kept, but not in Hong Kong. So that essentially means that Hong Kong, we are safer from a privacy perspective, but we've given up the possibility of certain forms of historical research. But it does allow the analysis of individual records without identifiers, subject to a check on the privacy risks of any output which were generated. So that's generally quite a reasonable solution. What about public registers? So in fact, when the ordinance, the Personal Data Privacy Ordinance, was originally being proposed, there are protections in there for access and correction prior to proposed adverse administrative or private decisions, and only approval for matching of public registers if the competing social need overrides privacy interests. Well, the problem is then what to do about public registers. So we recommended in the reports that the use limitation exemption only applied for the original purpose. And it was agreed that the government would deal with the issues rather than putting it inside the ordinance. However, this has not happened. Witness the recent problems with journalists and the Transport Department vehicle data, which was clearly not for the original purpose, and the problems with fixing the company's ordinance when LegCo basically refused to make the changes needed to protect privacy of company directors. Now, in fact, the government issued a memo in 2000, more than 20 years ago, which it has still not lived up to in terms of the protections that were supposed to have taken place for public registers. And again in 2012, they restated that putting personal data in the public domain does not make the data available for use for any purpose. And indeed, this links to, some of you may know, the case of Do No Evil. This is not an operating principle, but a key example of a private sector app that tried to match government data from three sources: litigation, bankruptcy, and company directorship. But it didn't have adequate privacy protections. So the Privacy Commissioner said disclosure of litigation, bankruptcy, and company directors' data via the app has exceeded reasonable expectation on their use, neither consistent with nor directly related to the original purposes of the judiciary, the official receiver's office, and the company's registry in collecting this data, and hence GDI, the company, had contravened the Personal Data Protection Ordinance. Well, there's a slight problem with that, as well as a thing I support. So I support that there was a problem because there was a privacy problem, because they had matched on name and address, which is not unique, and they had provided no access and correction ability. So there's a potential for serious negative consequences from matching errors, and so there was a need for action. But they claimed that they should have known the original purpose. Well, what was the original purpose? Unfortunately, judiciary nowhere states the purpose of the information in their public registers, and the company's registry continues to release address data of directors, which is hard to justify as related to the original purpose. Right, so there is clearly a problem with the government's own regulation of public registers. So what about the e-health records? So e-health records are essentially the data which the hospital authority has collected. So Hong Kong is very special because the public hospitals are nearly free, so they're widely used and they have very complete electronic records for hospitals and for public health clinics, indeed including sexual hygiene clinics. So the consequence is that when the e-health records bill was put through LegCo, the government insisted that you have to sign up for all data being made accessible or nothing. So the doctors get to choose, the doctors and the hospital authority get to choose what data shows up. You only get to say, I share everything that they've made available or nothing. So clearly big data enthusiasts say, yes, we should have access to this data because they assume anonymity removes the risks, as they do not understand re-identification risk. And in fact, you should notice that if you've gone through the vaccination already, as I have, that there is a link to the e-health. The government is trying to get everybody who goes to get vaccinated to sign up for e-health without disclosing what this privacy risk is. That you're not just sharing your vaccination records, you're sharing all records of every visit you have ever made to a government hospital or a government clinic. So what about research data? So I said that originally that statement at the beginning was about research data. Well, unfortunately, Hong Kong is still somewhat in the dark ages. Hong Kong U has taken the lead in Hong Kong by requiring the archiving of research data for all new research projects funded by the government and for all research postgraduate thesis. However, the objectives of the sharing process is about research integrity. There is no obligation to ever share this data that you have archived. So it's like we have the equivalent of the government records law, but no access to information. So there is no conception of the privacy risks or, on the other side, of the benefits of reanalysis, and so very few people have shared. Because again, the tragedy of the commons, as an academic, I don't apparently benefit very much by sharing my data with everyone else. I only share from publishing it myself within the system. Unfortunately, academics are often very naive about personal data. I have previous experience where academics insisted to me that anonymized DNA they should be able to share it with anybody they saw fit, even without getting consent for that sharing from the original provider of that DNA. They were completely unaware of the privacy risks involved. Now, I do need to, at this point, to give credit for what has been achieved. So Data.gov.hk was a good start and has improved greatly over time. The coverage is much better. There are much better licensing terms, but many crucial data sets are missing to my knowledge. So there's almost nothing in there relating to policing or crime. So as I mentioned, crime details by district. Now I know this data exists because it's used to create the Hong Kong-wide statistics, but the police officially denies that it exists when I try to access it under the Code of Access to Information. So, watch this space. The key question is whether the final Law Reform Commission proposals for those two laws will be reasonable and whether they will be implemented. So I encourage all of you who feel strongly about this to attend LegCo panel meetings. Hopefully sometime later this year, the proposals will be released and there will be a panel meeting. And I will certainly be there trying to persuade the government, persuade the LegCo members to implement a very broad version of both the records law and the access to information law. So let's just come back to a statement I gave at the beginning. So again, publicly funded data are a public good. I think that is undeniable. Produced in the public interest, that should be the case. So then the question is whether you agree that that leads to the conclusion they should be made openly available with as few restrictions as possible in a timely and responsible manner. And I would argue it should not actually be about intellectual property. The primary issue should be that it does not harm privacy. That's the only important risk I would argue for publicly funded data. So again, my questions, is this justified? And I would say, to me, it's obvious that public funding should lead to public benefit. Again, should it apply to all publicly funded data or just research data? I would argue all data at least has potential value. Indeed, as I said, I would argue this should even apply to publicly regulated data. What is responsible? I would argue the primary issue is to protect privacy, and that maximizing the public value clearly means making the data as openly available as is safe to do so. And I think the Census and Statistics Department example shows how we can maximize the value even if it can't be made openly available. And clearly the tragedy of the commons is relevant at least in the context of research data, because the person who collected that data is not necessarily the person who will get the full benefit. So I welcome any questions or comments. I put up here my post-Hong Kong U email address, johnbs@mac.com, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you very much.